Belgium, Spain, Greece, France, Portugal, all of them burning at the same time. 2,000 firefighters on the ground, around 20 aircraft in the air, 4 active fire fronts on a single blaze, temperatures pushing past 40 degrees, and no rain anywhere in the forecast. Europe's summer of fire is not slowing down. It is spreading. One country after another is watching its own land disappear under smoke, and the crews sent to stop it are running out of places to stand. So here is the question worth asking, honestly. Is an entire continent starting to lose the fight against its own climate? Let me take you through what is actually happening on the ground, right now, country by country, because the headlines are moving so fast that the details are getting lost, and the details are where this story lives. Start with Portugal, because Portugal is where the numbers are ugliest. On the 19th of August, multiple wildfires were burning across the north of the country at the same time. Not one large fire with a name and a face, several in different districts, all pulling on the same national pool of firefighters, trucks, and aircraft. The most serious of them started on the 16th of August in a parish called Cabeça Boa that sits inside the municipality of Torre de Moncorvo in the northeastern district of Bragança. This is inland Portugal, dry country, rolling hills, scrub, terraced slopes, small villages spread thin across the landscape with narrow roads connecting them. The fire did not stay where it started. It pushed across the boundary into the neighboring municipality of Carazeda de Ancia, which tells you something important on its own. Once a blaze crosses from one municipality into another, the response gets more complicated. Different local commands, different road networks, different water sources. The fire does not care about the line on the map, but the people fighting it have to work around it. Meanwhile, other fires were burning elsewhere, one in Aruca, in the northern coastal district of Aveiro. Another in Santo Tirso, inside Porto's metropolitan area. That last one matters because Porto is not a remote rural district. It is one of the most densely populated regions in the country. When flames show up on the edge of a metropolitan area, the calculation changes from protecting forest to protecting people and houses. Across all of it, more than 2,000 emergency personnel and around 20 aircraft were deployed to fight the rural wildfires and stop the spread. By the middle of the afternoon on the 19th, 3 of those incidents were still classed as major and still going. The one causing the most worry was Torre de Moncorvo. More than 400 emergency personnel were working that fire on the ground. They had over 140 vehicles supporting them. 4 aircraft were flying above it. According to Portuguese broadcaster RTP, that blaze still had one active front at the start of the afternoon. Now, one active front sounds like good news, and in a way it is. Earlier in a fire's life, it can have several. Getting it down to one means crews have managed to box in most of the perimeter and are now dealing with a single stretch that is still moving. Authorities said they hope to declare the fire under control a few hours later and then move into the mop-up phase. I want to pause on that phrase because it gets misunderstood constantly. Under control does not mean out. It does not mean finished. It means the fire's edges have been secured well enough that it is not expected to jump the lines and grow again. The inside can still be burning. Trees can still be standing and smoldering. Under control is a status about the perimeter, not about the flames. And mop up, which sounds like the easy part, is often the longest and most miserable stretch of the whole job. Crews walk the burnt ground looking for hot spots. They dig out smoldering roots. They soak stumps that are still glowing hours or days after the visible fire has passed. Skip that work, and one strong wind can restart the entire thing from a single hidden ember. Fires that were declared beaten have come back to life exactly this way. By that point, more than 2,000 hectares had already burned in Torre de Moncorvo since the 15th. To put that in a shape you can picture, 2,000 hectares is roughly 20 square kilometers. Imagine a block of land 4 kilometers wide and 5 kilometers deep, all of it blackened, in one municipality alone. Then there was Aruca, in the coastal district of Aveiro. That one broke out on Monday night. By 4 in the afternoon the next day, more than 300 firefighters were working it, with around 100 vehicles and 2 aircraft in the operational zone. This fire was burning through scrubland, and it still had 4 active fronts that morning. Scrubland is a particular headache. It is low, dense, dry vegetation, and it does not behave like a forest fire. In a forest, the flame front is often slower and easier to read. Scrub burns fast and flat. It catches quickly, races across open ground, and changes direction the moment the wind shifts. It also grows back fast, which means the same slopes can be ready to burn again within a few seasons. 4 active fronts means the fire is not a line. It is a shape, moving outward in 4 separate directions at once. Every front needs its own crews, its own vehicles, its own water supply, and its own escape route. 300 firefighters sounds like a large force until you split it 4 ways across rough terrain. The situation was serious enough that civil protection adopted preventive safety measures in some communities, specifically to protect homes and lives. That is the language authorities use when they are moving people, closing access, or preparing to evacuate before anything has actually reached a village. It is a decision made early, on purpose, because waiting until flames are visible from the window is how people die on the road out. The third major incident was in Santo Tirso, in Porto's metropolitan area. Civil protection there had around 200 personnel engaged, supported by more than 60 vehicles and one aircraft. That fire started late in the afternoon of the 17th. By the 19th, it had already consumed more than 900 hectares. Do the arithmetic on that, and it becomes uncomfortable. 900 hectares in roughly 2 days in a metropolitan district with 200 people and a single aircraft assigned to it. That is not a criticism of the crews. It is a description of what happens when a country has multiple large fires burning simultaneously and a finite number of aircraft to share between them. Every plane sent to one fire is a plane not available for another. Priorities have to be made in real time, and someone always ends up at the back of the queue. And all of this was happening while hot, dry weather sat stubbornly over most of the country. The Portuguese Institute for Sea and Atmosphere placed 9 districts under orange warning that Tuesday. The rest of mainland Portugal was under yellow warning, with only Lisbon, Setúbal, and Faro left out. Look at that map for a second. Almost the entire mainland under some level of alert at the same time. Not one hot region while the rest stays mild. The whole country. Maximum temperatures above 40 degrees were expected in several regions, and crucially, they came with very low air humidity across most of the territory. That humidity detail is the one most people skip past, and it is arguably more important than the temperature. Here is why. Heat dries fuel out, but dry air keeps it dry and pulls even more moisture out of everything it touches. Leaves, grass, dead branches, soil, all of it gives up water to the atmosphere when the humidity drops. Fuel that would normally resist a spark becomes something that catches instantly. Low humidity also means fires do not calm down properly at night. Normally, evening brings cooler air and rising moisture, and fire behavior eases enough for crews to make progress and get some rest. When the air stays bone dry after dark, that recovery window disappears. The fire keeps running through the night, and so do the firefighters. Because of exactly this combination, the northern and central inland regions, where temperatures were forecast to be highest, were facing a very high to maximum risk of rural fire. Authorities urged people to take preventive measures. Maximum is the top of the scale. There is no level above it. That rating does not predict a fire. It describes a landscape that will ignite from almost anything and burn hard once it does. A machine spark, a discarded cigarette, a piece of glass, a power line touching a branch. There's also something about the northern Portuguese landscape itself that makes these fires harder to stop, and it has very little to do with the weather on any given day. Inland districts like Bragança and Aveiro are full of small villages, and many of them have been slowly emptying for decades. Younger people moved toward the coast or abroad. Farms that were once worked every season were left alone. Terraces that used to be cleared, grazed, and cut fell quiet. That sounds like a social story rather than a fire story, but it is both. Land that is farmed or grazed stays broken up. Animals eat the undergrowth. People cut fire breaks without even thinking of them as fire breaks, simply by keeping their fields tidy. When that stops, vegetation fills in every gap. Scrub grows thick and continuous across slopes that used to be a patchwork. Continuous fuel is what allows a small ignition to become a regional emergency. A fire in broken terrain hits bare ground, a plowed field, or a grazed hillside and slows down. A fire in unbroken scrub simply keeps going until something stops it, and often the only thing available is a road, a river, or a wall of firefighters. Add the terrain itself and it gets worse. Fire climbs faster than it descends because the heat rising ahead of the flames dries and preheats the vegetation above it. Steep valleys can channel wind and turn a slope into something closer to a chimney. Those same valleys are frequently the places crews cannot safely enter because there is no escape route if the wind turns. None of this is unique to Portugal. Similar patterns exist across southern Europe. But it explains why the same country appears in this story year after year, and why containment can take days even when thousands of people are working the fire. Now let us move north, because the more surprising half of this story is not in Portugal at all. On the 17th of August, firefighters in Belgium were battling the worst wildfires the country has seen in a century. Read that again, because Belgium is not a country. People associate with wildfire. It is small. It is green. It is famous for rain, not drought. Not. If you had asked most Europeans a few years ago which country would be facing its largest fire on record, Belgium would not have made the list. According to Reuters, around 500 firefighters were fighting a blaze that had already destroyed 3,000 hectares, which is about 7,400 acres of land. A forestry officer described it as Belgium's biggest wildfire on record, and said it had caused irreparable damage to rare biotopes. That word irreparable is doing a lot of work, and it deserves explaining, because this is where the Belgian fire becomes something different from an ordinary blaze. Inside the burnt area were 2 active upland peat bogs. There are only 3 of those in the entire country. They are among the most protected habitats Belgium has. And peat bogs are not something you replant. They take thousands of years to form. Layer by layer, over millennia, plant material builds up in waterlogged ground and slowly compresses without fully decaying. What ends up under your feet is a deep, wet, spongy archive of thousands of years of biology. 2 of those 3 bogs were destroyed. Not damaged, not set back a few decades. Gone in a way that will not return in any human timescale. There is another problem with peat, and it is the reason the Belgian fire refuses to end. Peat does not burn like grass or timber. It burns downward into the ground. Once the fire eats its way into the peat layer, it keeps going below the surface, sometimes in places where there is barely any oxygen at all. You cannot see it. Fly over the area, and it looks calm. Walk across it, and it looks finished. Underneath it is still smoldering and slowly working its way sideways through the soil. Then, days or weeks later, it surfaces somewhere else. Not necessarily far away, but far enough that anyone who declared victory looks foolish. That is why officials warned this operation would take weeks, possibly months. Crews have to keep monitoring the ground long after the last visible flame is gone, watching for new outbreaks that could spread into the areas that have not burnt yet. A peat fire is not a fire you extinguish so much as when you wait out and hunt down. Fighting one is also strange work. Spraying water across the surface achieves very little because the burning is happening below. Crews sometimes have to dig into the ground and soak it from within, or flood whole sections and hold them wet. Thermal cameras get used to find heat that is invisible to the eye. Teams walk the same ground again and again, day after day, looking for a wisp of steam or a patch where the snow of ash sits slightly differently. There is a further problem that makes peat fires worse than they appear on a damage map. Peat is not just habitat. It is stored carbon, locked away over thousands of years of slow growth. When it burns, that carbon is released, and the ground that used to hold water like a sponge loses its structure. Even the sections that survive are left drier and more vulnerable, which makes the next fire in that landscape easier to start and harder to stop. It is a loss that quietly compounds. Rain over eastern Belgium brought some relief to the crews, but nobody involved was calling it over. Walloon authorities reported on the morning of the 17th that the fire had been contained in the areas that emergency crews could actually reach. Overnight, though, it had continued to spread through terrain that was inaccessible on foot. Its expansion stayed limited, mostly thanks to more favorable winds and some rainfall, but it kept moving. That single detail explains why modern firefighting still fails sometimes. It is rarely a shortage of will. It is geography. If a crew physically cannot get to a section of burning ground, they cannot fight it there. They can only work the edges, protect what is reachable, and wait for the weather or the terrain to give them an opening. Around 600 residents who had been evacuated earlier were still unable to go home. No new evacuations were planned for the moment, which was the one genuinely encouraging line in the update. Several roads in and around the affected area stayed closed. Evacuation is one thing. Being told you cannot return is another kind of stress entirely. Those 600 people were living out of bags, waiting on updates, with no clear answer about what would be left when they finally got back. The fire also came close enough to matter across the border. German media reported that it was no longer spreading toward the border town of Monschau. Around 30 residents there had already been evacuated as a precaution on Sunday evening because of heavy smoke and the risk of the fire pushing further. Smoke alone is enough to move people. You do not need flames at the door. Wildfire smoke carries fine particles deep into the lungs. And for anyone elderly, very young, or already struggling with breathing, a thick smoke plume is a genuine medical emergency on its own. Then came the part of this story that I think says the most about where Europe now stands. According to regional officials, nearly 500 personnel and more than 120 vehicles were involved in firefighting operations on Monday. Above them, 9 aircraft were flying. Those aircraft came from Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, Norway, and Sweden. 5 countries sending aircraft to one fire. The aerial operation was coordinated by the European Union's Emergency Response Coordination Center. That is the body that exists precisely for moments like this, when a national response is no longer enough, and neighboring states have to pool equipment across borders in a hurry. Think about the logistics for a moment. Aircraft from Norway and Sweden do not simply take off and arrive. Flight clearances have to be arranged. Crews need briefings on unfamiliar terrain. Radio communications that have to work between teams speaking different languages. Water sources have to be identified and shared. Refueling and maintenance have to be organized in a country that was not planning for these aircraft to be there. That entire machine exists because Europe has learnt the hard way and repeatedly that individual countries can be overwhelmed. When several are burning at once, aircraft become the scarcest resource on the continent. Everyone wants them. Nobody has enough. It is worth being clear about what those aircraft actually do, because people often assume planes put fires out. They do not. A waterbombing aircraft drops a load that lasts seconds. The purpose is not to extinguish the fire. It is to knock down the flame height along a specific stretch, cool the ground and buy a window of a few minutes so that crews on the ground can move in, cut a line, and secure that section. Aircraft support firefighters. They do not replace them. A fire that is only being fought from the air is a fire nobody has managed to reach yet. They also have hard limits. They cannot fly in heavy smoke because pilots need to see the ground they are aiming at. They cannot fly safely in strong or shifting wind, which is exactly the condition present when a fire is at its most dangerous. They cannot work in darkness in most cases, which means the whole aerial effort switches off at sunset and does not return until morning. Anyone who has watched a fire grow overnight has watched that gap in action, and every drop requires a refill. Aircraft have to reach a lake, a reservoir, a river, or an airstrip, load up, and fly back. The further that water source sits from the fire, the fewer runs each aircraft can make in a day. In inland districts with limited open water, that turnaround time can quietly have the effectiveness of the whole fleet. So, when a country reports 20 aircraft deployed nationally, that number is impressive and also thinner than it sounds once you split it across several fires, subtract the ones grounded by smoke or wind, and account for the hours lost flying to and from water. And a Belgian commander summed up the reality on the ground with the kind of plain honesty that cuts through every official statement. They had managed to hold the fire where the firemen were positioned. But there was still a place, completely inaccessible, where the fire was continuing to burn, heading in the direction of Monschau in Germany. Held where we can stand, still burning where we cannot. That single sentence describes the situation across half a continent right now, because Belgium and Portugal are only two entries on a much longer list. Wildfires have ravaged areas across multiple European countries this season, forcing evacuations in France, Spain, Belgium, Germany, and Greece. Different landscapes, different climates, different firefighting traditions and budgets, the same outcome. And underneath all of it sits the condition that made this possible. Many European countries recorded their hottest month on record in July, with ongoing droughts making everything worse. That combination is the whole story compressed into one line. Drought is the slow part. It works over months. Rivers drop, reservoirs shrink, soil moisture falls away. Deep roots that normally hold water start to fail. Living vegetation, which usually acts as a brake on fire because it has to be dried out before it burns, turns into fuel that is already halfway prepared. A drought, stressed forest is not the same forest it was 2 years ago, even if it looks identical from the road. Then heat arrives on top of that, and it is the fast part. It pulls the last of the moisture out. It creates unstable air that helps fires build their own wind. It stretches the burning window later into the evening and starts it earlier in the morning. Add wind, and you have every ingredient at once. Fuel that is ready, weather that is willing, and a spark, which is never the hard part to find. There's one more layer here that I think deserves attention, and it is the northern part of this story rather than the southern one. Portugal, Spain, and Greece have long experience with wildfire. Their crews are trained for it. Their agencies plan for it. Their populations, broadly, understand what a fire season means and what to do when a warning is issued. That does not make the fires less destructive, but it means the response starts from a position of readiness. Belgium and Germany are in a different position. Countries in that part of Europe have historically built their emergency services around floods, storms, and industrial accidents. Wildfire was a minor concern. Equipment, training, and terrain access were never designed around it in the same way. When a fire of record size arrives in a country where nothing on that scale has happened in 100 years, the gap between what is needed and what exists becomes obvious very quickly. That is why the cross-border aircraft matter so much. It is not just cooperation for its own sake. It is filling a genuine capability gap in real time. So where does that leave things? Portugal was still fighting 3 major incidents with thousands of personnel committed and almost the entire mainland under weather alert, with maximum fire risk in the interior and no rain expected. Belgium was watching its largest recorded wildfire burn underground through peat that will take months to fully declare dead, with 600 people still displaced and irreplaceable habitat already lost. Germany had smoke crossing its border and residents moved as a precaution. France, Spain, and Greece had all seen evacuations of their own. None of these countries is failing to respond. Every one of them has put serious numbers of people, vehicles, and aircraft into the fight. Crews are working through nights that never really cool down, on ground that keeps reigniting behind them. The harder question is whether a response, however well organized, can keep pace with conditions that are lining up like this more often. When the hottest month on record lands on soil that has been drying for years, the fires that follow are not really unusual events. They are what the setup was always going to produce, and the fires are not the end of it. Burnt slopes lose the vegetation and root systems that hold soil in place. When the autumn rain finally arrives, those same hillsides can turn into mudslides and flash floods. The disaster does not close when the smoke clears. It just changes form. There is also the calendar to think about, and this is the part that concerns the agencies most. August is not the end of the fire season in southern Europe. September regularly produces serious fires, and sometimes the worst ones, because by then the landscape has been drying all summer with nothing left to give. Fuel moisture is at its lowest point of the year. The heat may ease slightly, but the vegetation does not recover just because the calendar page turns. All it takes is one more hot spell with wind behind it. Meanwhile, the crews are not fresh. They have been working since June. Equipment has been running hard for weeks. Aircraft need maintenance hours that nobody can spare. Volunteer firefighters, who make up a large part of the response in several of these countries, have jobs and families they have already left for too long. That is the quiet cost that does not show up in any statistic. Even if the weather breaks tomorrow, the system that fought this summer will start next summer tired, with less equipment and thinner reserves than it had this time. Before you go, I want to hear from you, because I think this story splits people in an interesting way. When you look at what is happening across Europe this summer, does it read to you as a run of bad luck? A stretch of extreme weather that will pass? Or does it look like the shape of every summer from here on out? Drop your answer in the comments. I read them, and the disagreement in that thread is usually more interesting than any single opinion. If this gave you a clearer picture of what is actually burning and why the response is struggling, hit the like button. It helps grounded breakdowns like this reach people, instead of recycled clips with no context attached. And subscribe so you're here as this season develops. Because based on the forecast coming out of these countries right now, this is not the last update on it. I will see you in the next one.